I'm your perfect and humble leader, Chris Valenti, and today we're doing a deep dive on the Insurrection Act of 1807 and martial law, its deployment throughout U.S. history, and how that's important for today's political climate. So we're going to do a deep dive into it's written in 1807. We invoked it a handful of times. The use of martial law has been relatively rampant in U.S. history. So we're going to cover all of that. But before we do, I just want to remind you to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It costs you nothing and it helps me immensely. Also, I film almost all of my YouTube videos live. So if you hit that notification bell, you can join the chat. Say hi to the chat, and you can watch me make these videos live. Other than that, if you want to help the channel financially, because this is real independent media, I have no funding. So if you want to help me out financially, there's a couple of ways you could do that. You could become a patron on Patreon. Huge shout out to my patrons. I love all of you. You could become a member here on YouTube. Huge shout out to my members. I love all of you. You could buy some dope ass Valenti Videos merch down below, and you could use the 40% off discount for the Vantage subscription on Ground News. I've never had a conversation with an advertiser or a billionaire or a foreign government, so if you want to keep this operation going, feel free. Other than that, let's do a deep dive into this rabbit hole. So the Insurrection Act of 1807, it's a U.S. federal law that empowers the President of the United States to nationally deploy the U.S. military and to federalize the National Guard units of the individual states in specific circumstances, such as the suppression of civil disorder, of insurrection, and of armed rebellion against the federal government of the United States. The Insurrection Act provides a statutory exemption to the Posse Comitatus Act that legally limits the President's deploying the U.S. military to enforce either civil law or criminal law within the United States. So what does this mean? In layman's terms, what this means is that we already have a law called the Posse Comitatus Act that was invoked in 1878. It was signed in by President Rutherford B. Hayes, and it limits the use of the military on domestic policies, like within the United States, right? You have to use police. You can't use the military. Well, if you declared the Insurrection Act of 1807, you invoked that act, that overpowers the Posse Comitatus Act, right? So essentially, this overpowers that. It means that you can use the military to enforce specific regulations or laws, right? So the Insurrection Act, it was written by Thomas Jefferson in 1807, and it's had a couple of major amendments in 1871, 2006, 2007. It has been modified multiple times. But this is important because Donald Trump may or may not invoke the Insurrection Act tomorrow as of filming. Today is April 19th, 2025, and tomorrow is the deadline for his invoking of the Insurrection Act based off of a executive order that he wrote in January 2020. We're going to cover that at the end. So this is written by Thomas Jefferson in 1807, and it is really written with the understanding of it's designed to prevent the United States from collapsing if facing some sort of insurrection, a military invasion, an armed rebellion, right? It has some pretty cut and dry, pretty clear parameters that you would need to invoke this act. And there's one other thing that I want to cover is that the Insurrection Act is not the same as martial law. So we're going to cover what martial law is right now. Let me zoom in for you. Martial law is the replacement of civilian government by military rule and the suspension of civil legal processes for military powers. Martial law can continue for a specified amount of time or indefinitely, which means permanently. And standard civil liberties may be suspended for as long as martial law continues. That would be something like the right to protest. Most often, martial law is declared in times of war or emergencies, such as civil unrest and natural disasters. Alternatively, martial law can be declared in instances of military coups d'etats. So, something like during the insurrection on January 6th, the proclamation, the invoking of martial law would have been absolutely reasonable, but still, it's not necessary. It is a very extreme measure. Excuse me. Is a very extreme measure. So, perhaps you're wondering, hey, Chris, when have we ever invoked the Insurrection Act and or declared martial law throughout our history? You said it was relatively rampant. Well, I put together a handful of times that we've done that because it's happened so many times. So the first time that the the first time that it is referenced is during, let me scroll to the tip top here, the War of 1812. Okay? The War of 1812 was fought by the United States and its allies against the United Kingdom and its allies in North America. So this is sort of like the Revolutionary War Round 2. It began when the United States declared war on Britain on June 18, 1812. Although peace terms were agreed upon in December of 1814, the war did not officially end until the peace treaty was ratified by the United States Congress. Anglo-American tensions stemmed from long-standing differences over territorial expansion in North America and British support for Tecumseh's Confederacy, which resisted U.S. colonial settlement in the Old Northwest. In 1807, these tensions escalated after the Royal Navy began enforcing tighter restrictions on American trade with France and impressed sailors who were originally British subjects, even those who had acquired American citizenship. Opinion in the U.S. was split on how to respond, and although majorities in both the House and the Senate voted for war, they were divided along strict party lines, with the Democratic-Republican Party in favor and the Federalist Party against. News of British concessions made in an attempt to avoid war did not reach the U.S. until late July, by which time the conflict was already underway. And here we have some artwork from the conflict. I believe during the War of 1812, the British burnt down our White House, if I'm correct. The burning of Washington. Yeah, they ended up or maybe it was the Canadians that they got to do this, but we got some great artwork from it. So if I scroll down, I've got my highlighted portions here. Where are they? Give it to me, give it to me, give me my highlighted portions. I asked for my highlighted portions. But listen, during the War of 1812, martial law was declared, the invocation of the Insurrection Act in the United States as a way to kind of hold the line. The next time that that martial law was declared, or the Insurrection Act, was during Nat Turner's Rebellion, which is historically known as the Southampton Insurrection. See, now you understand that the Insurrection Act is declared when there's a fucking insurrection. It was a slave rebellion that took place in Southampton County, Virginia, led by Nat Turner. There he is there. Was an enslaved black carpenter and preacher who led a 4-day rebellion of both enslaved and free black people in Southampton County, Virginia. Based. The rebels, made up of enslaved African Americans, killed between 55 and 65 white people, making it the deadliest slave revolt for the latter racial group in U.S. history. The rebellion was effectively suppressed within a few days at Belmont Plantation on the morning of August 23rd, but Turner survived in hiding for more than 30 days afterward. There was widespread fear among the white population in the rebellion's aftermath. Militias and mobs killed as many as 120 enslaved people and free African Americans in retaliation. After trials, the Commonwealth of Virginia executed 56 enslaved people accused of participating in the rebellion, including Turner himself. Many black people had not participated were also persecuted in the frenzy. Because Turner was educated and a preacher, Southern state legislators passed new laws prohibiting the education of enslaved people and free blacks, restricting rights of assembly and other civil liberties for free blacks, and requiring white ministers to be present at all worship services. So this is another example of the government using the Insurrection Act in order to put the boot on the neck of the American fucking people. Or in this case, I guess, freed slaves and active slaves were probably not considered people, let alone American people. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. So this was the, what is this called? The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So in 1855, the Wisconsin Supreme Court became the only state high court to declare the Fugitive Slave Act unconstitutional as a result of a case involving fugitive slave Joshua Glover and Sherman Booth, who led efforts that thwarted Glover's recapture. So jury nullification occurred at local northern juries acquitted men accused of violating the law. Secretary of State Daniel Webster was a key supporter of the law and expressed in his famous 7th of March speech he wanted high-profile convictions. The jury nullifications ruined his presidential aspirations and his last-ditch effort to find a compromise between the North and the South. Webster led the prosecution against men accused of rescuing Shadrach Minkins in 1851 from Boston officials who were intended to return Minkins to slavery. The juries convicted none of the men. Webster sought to enforce a law that was extremely unpopular in northern states, and his Whig party passed him over again when they chose a presidential nominee in 1852. So essentially what you're starting to pick up on, if you're seeing the trend here, is that when the civilians of the United States act out of line in terms of the powers that be, the state, the Department of Defense, and the military's current prerogative, if you try and act out of line and use your Second Amendment rights or even your First Amendment rights, you protest en masse, the government already has a blueprint in line to label what you're doing as an insurrection and then thwart it by using the military, the National Guard, the Army. I mean, the National Guard isn't the military, but by using members of the military in order to usurp things that we already have in place, like the Posse Comitatus Act. So I'd say the most famous use of it is obviously the American Civil War. There's never been an insurrection in American history that is even close to the level of damage that the Civil War caused. And as we all know, I mean, I love how it's also known by other names, but the Civil War was the bloodiest conflict that America has ever been involved in, right? In 1861, by states that had been seceded from the Union, the Confederacy is formed. The central conflict leading to the war was a dispute over whether slavery should be permitted to expand into the Western territories, leading to more slave states, or to be prohibited from doing so, which many believed would place slavery on a course of ultimate extinction. The problem was that in these southern states, slaves were quite literally their form of currency in terms of a lot of these rich people, the rich plantation owners in the South. They didn't have liquid cash. What they had was hundreds of slaves and all of this land, and the land was operated by the slaves, and that was how they were able to show their wealth. If you suddenly abolished slavery, not only would these slaves be free, but then all of these people who are quote-unquote wealthy would no longer be wealthy. All of their wealth is accrued in slaves and plantations. They don't have the ability or the skill to fucking take care of these plantations. They were assets, exactly. Thank you, Jack Wolf, my moderator. So let me just pull this up. Insurrection Act during the Civil War. Martial law during the Civil War. So, during the Civil War, sorry, get that up for you. Let me zoom in again for you. There we go. During the Civil War, President Lincoln invoked martial law multiple times to address the rebellion and enforce Union authority. He suspended, that was my computer, not yours. He suspended habeas corpus, allowing for the arrest and detention of those deemed to be aiding the Confederacy. This included individuals suspected of being spies, rebels, or those discouraging enlistment. So even Abraham Lincoln, who was known as one of the best presidents in American history, even he understood that he had to declare martial law in order and suspend civil liberties to round up dissidents of his regime and throw them in fucking prison. And the thing is, he was completely in the right. I hope you're starting to understand that it is not unprecedented, nor is it abnormal for a president to invoke the Insurrection Act and or declare martial law. So then we move on to even stricter law, which is after the Civil War. We've got the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871. Let me zoom in again. The adoption of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution extended civil and legal protections to former slaves and prohibited states from disenfranchising voters on account of race, color, or previous condition. Let's move on to this. In its first effort to counteract such use of violence and intimidation, Congress passed the Enforcement Act of May 1870, which prohibited groups of people from banding together, quote, or to go in disguise upon public highways or upon the premises of another with the intention of violating citizens' constitutional rights. Even this legislation did not diminish harassment of black voters. In December of 1870, they introduced a resolution requesting the president to communicate any information he had about certain incidents or threatened resistance to the execution of laws within the United States. After the Senate adopted Morton's resolution, President Ulysses S. Grant submitted several War Department reports relating to events in several southern states. These reports were referred to the Select Committee of the Senate to investigate the alleged outrages in southern states. So this is when we start to get into the Force Acts, right? The Second Force Act, which became law in February of 1871, placed administration of national elections under control of the federal government and empowered federal judges and the United States Marshals to supervise local polling places. The Third Force Act empowered the president to use armed forces to combat those who conspired to deny equal protection of the law and to suspend habeas corpus if necessary to enforce the act. So this is an expansion upon the Insurrection Act, and what it means is that during federal elections, during any election, if there are groups of people who try to intimidate or prevent people from voting for whoever they want, the president of the United States can literally use the military to stop those people from preventing the, the fucking transition of, or to stop fucking voting. If you want to go vote and there's a group of fucking people trying to intimidate you, the president can dead ass use the goddamn military to force those fucking people off the premise, right? So, again, guys, there is a litany of different methods in which the president and the government can declare martial law or invoke the Insurrection Act, and they've done it many, many times. So then we've got a big part of the integration, the desegregation of schools, right? You start to move into the civil rights era, right? When segregation was deemed unconstitutional and every school across the United States was forced to desegregate and allow black and white students to go to the same schools, we got massive resistance in a lot of these southern states, right? And we've had, what happened was there was a crisis, right? We got the Little Rock Nine. It was a group of 9 African-American students who were enrolled in Little Rock Central High School in 1957. Their enrollment was followed by the Little Rock Crisis, in which the students were initially prevented from entering the racially segregated school by the governor of Arkansas. They then attended after the intervention of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, if I scroll down, I could probably find, here's what it is. All right, yeah. So several segregationist councils threatened to hold protests at Central High and physically blocked the black students from entering the school. Governor Orville Faubus deployed the Arkansas National Guard. He deployed the National Guard to literally stop these black students from going into the white school. And in retaliation, Woodrow Wilson Mann, the mayor of Little Rock, asked President Eisenhower to send the fucking 101st Airborne to enforce integration and protect the 9 students. What happened was President Eisenhower, based as fuck, invoked the Insurrection Act, deployed the 101st fucking Airborne. This is after World War II, by the way. And the 101st Airborne, the U.S. Army, they go to Little Rock without the black soldiers at request of the Department of Justice and federalized the National Guard. So those National Guard members who were forced to prevent the black students from entering under orders of the governor, the president goes, "Fuck you, governor of Arkansas. I usurp your power as the president, and now your troops are my fucking troops." The entire 10,000-member Arkansas National Guard taking it out of his control. 2 segregationists were injured in clashes with federal troops. One who was struck in the face with a buttstock after trying to grab a soldier's rifle, and the second who received a minor bayonet wound to the arm. So, this is an example of the Insurrection Act being used for a good cause. These schools were not, they refused to follow federal law. They refused to desegregate their schools. They deployed the National Guard. They threatened the lives of these students. So what ended up happening? The president said, well, that's an insurrection. You can't use 10,000 fucking National Guard troops to disobey U.S. law. Fuck you, we're invoking the Insurrection Act on your ass. And then the same thing happened again in 1962 with Ole Miss University, right? The Ole Miss Riot, or the Oxford Incident of 1962, was a major event in the civil rights movement, where a mob of white protesters rioted at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi, after the integration of James Meredith, the first African-American student admitted to the university. The incident resulted in violence and the death of 2 people. So this is another example of when, President John F. Kennedy, he deployed federal marshals and troops to protect Meredith and enforce the court order, right? So even JFK, he went ahead and declared the Insurrection Act and fought back against these people. And then again, civil rights movement, right? The Selma to Montgomery marches were a series of protests in 1965 that played a crucial role in the fight for voting rights for African Americans in the United States. The most famous of these marches, Bloody Sunday, saw marchers violently confronted by state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. These events, culminating in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, were instrumental in securing the right to vote for all citizens. On Bloody Sunday, marchers were violently attacked by law enforcement officials after crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Again, 1967, where do we have it? The 1967 Detroit Riot, also known as the 12th Street Riot, is the bloodiest of the urban riots in the United States during the long, hot summer of 1967, composed mainly of confrontations between African-American residents and the Detroit Police Department. So what ends up happening is Governor George W. Romney ordered the Michigan Army National Guard into Detroit to end the disturbance. President Lyndon B. Johnson sent in the United States Army's 82nd and 100th Air Force, so here comes the 100th Air Force again, and to quell the riot. The riot resulted in 43 deaths, almost 1,200 people injured, over 7,200 arrests, and 400 buildings destroyed. The scale of the riot was the worst in the United States in 1863 New York City draft riots during the American Civil War, and it was not surpassed until the 1992 Los Angeles riots 25 years later, which we will be getting to in the rest of this video. Another time that we have martial law invoked is after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Actually, I believe when this happened, my father was still in the military, and he was forced to hold position and told, if anybody steps foot after curfew, body them. He didn't. Nobody did. Following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1968, martial law was declared in multiple cities, and the U.S. military was deployed to help quell the widespread riots that erupted. These riots led to the deaths of 43 people, and more than 3,800 National Guardsmen were rushed to Memphis to restore the order. Excuse me. In response to the unrest, President Lyndon B. Johnson deployed the National Guard and other military forces to help control the riots. Some cities, like Memphis, Tennessee, declared martial law, effectively giving the military authority to enforce law and order. Now, it's also been used for natural events like Hurricane Hugo. Hurricane Hugo was a powerful tropical cyclone that inflicted widespread destruction across the northeastern Caribbean. I believe it hit some U.S. Virgin Islands or some shit like that. And this was in 1989. Where was it? Which island was it? Yeah, the U.S. Virgin Islands. And they ended up declaring martial law to help quell the fucking civil unrest that was happening during the nightmare of it. And then again, in 1992 with the Rodney King riots. Now, you may be too young to know this, but before there was George Floyd, there was Rodney King. Same story, different man. Police abuse, violent abuse of black people. And in 1992, the Los Angeles riots, also called the South Central riots or the Rodney King riots, were a series of riots and civil disturbances that occurred in Los Angeles, California, during April and May of 1992. Unrest began in South Central LA on April 29th after a jury acquitted 4 officers of the LAPD charged with using excessive force in the arrest and beating of Rodney King. The incident had been videotaped by George Holliday, who was a bystander to the incident, and was heavily broadcast at various news and media outlets. The rioting took place in several areas across the Los Angeles metropolitan area as thousands of people rioted over 6 days following the verdict's announcement. Widespread looting, assault, and arson occurred during these riots. riots, which local police forces had difficulty controlling. The situation in Los Angeles area was resolved after the California National Guard, United States military, and several federal law enforcement agencies deployed more than 10,000 of their armed responders to assist in ending the violence and unrest. When the riots, including multiple shootouts, had ended, 63 people had been killed, 2,383 had been injured, more than 12,000 had been arrested, and the estimates of property damage were over $1 billion, making it the most destructive period in local unrest in U.S. history. Koreatown, situated just to the north and south of central LA, was disproportionately damaged because of racial tensions between communities. Yeah, the blacks and the Koreans fucking hated each other, and the Koreans were armed on their rooftops and were just defending it. It's actually pretty fucking crazy when you see it. Much of the blame for the extensive nature of the violence was attributed to the LAPD chief of police Daryl Gates, who had already announced his resignation by the time of the riots for failure to de-escalate the situation and overall mismanagement. So that's the history of it, of the Insurrection Act and of martial law. And now we get to the end of the rabbit hole with modern times, right? So we saw during Trump's first presidency, his first term, during the George Floyd protests, Trump asked if he could invoke the Insurrection Act and use the military to clear out the streets during the George Floyd protests, and he was declined. White House aides prepared a draft proclamation to invoke the Insurrection Act as then-President Donald Trump debated deploying active-duty U.S. soldiers in response to protests after the death of George Floyd. The aides put together the proposed proclamation the same day that the protesters were forcefully cleared from Lafayette Park across the street from the White House, traditionally used for peaceful protests and demonstrations. At the time, a livid Trump made clear to the then top cabinet members, Attorney General William Barr, Defense Secretary Mark Esper, and Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley, that he wanted active members of the military to patrol the streets in D.C. They were able to persuade him not to do that, the paper reported, but Trump ultimately did not invoke the act. But according to the Times, aides in the White House prepared for a ready-to-go document in case the situation outside the White House escalated and Trump knew the proclamation had been drafted. Now, as we're filming this right now on April 19th, 2025, there is a giant second hands-off protest right outside of the White House. People are pissed. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a legal permanent U.S. resident, green card carrying member of the United States, not a criminal, not a gang member, not an illegal immigrant, was sent over to the extermination camp in El Salvador. And the Trump administration admitted he was wrongfully sent there. He was erroneous, and they don't want to bring him back, and they're not going to bring him back. So people are pissed. And there's another fucking giant-ass protest, all nationwide, worldwide even. There's protests in fucking Italy right now. And the thing is, why is it important? Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because 89 days ago, Donald Trump passed this executive order. We're on whitehouse.gov. The Declaring a National Emergency at the Southern Border of the United States Executive Order, Presidential Action. Okay? Now, this is important. Pay attention. And if you scroll down to Section 6B, it says here that within 90 days of the date of this proclamation, which was January 20th, so within 90 days, which means tomorrow, April 20th, 2025. So we're just going to say that. By tomorrow, as of filming, so by April 20th, 2025, the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, and the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, shall submit a joint report to the President about the conditions at the southern border of the United States. So let's again rephrase that. This says, by tomorrow, Pete Hegseth and Kristi Noem need to give a report to Donald Trump about the conditions at the southern border and any recommendations regarding what to do, including whether to invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807. So what this means is by tomorrow, by the end of the day tomorrow, Donald Trump will receive a joint report that when he opens it will either say, yes, sir, invoke the Insurrection Act, or no, sir, don't invoke the Insurrection Act. And the people who will be writing that report are Kristi Noem and Pete Hegseth. Now, at the same time, we have Donald Trump tweeting this out. Sleepy Joe Biden, the worst president in the history of the United States, has allowed millions and millions of criminals, many of them murderers, drug dealers, and people released from prisons and mental institutions from all over the world, to enter our country through its very dangerous and ill-conceived open border. Sorry, but it's my job to get these killers and thugs out of here. That's what I got elected to do. MAGA. So what he's saying is, he's greasing you up for tomorrow. Millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of criminals, murderers, drug dealers from prisons and mental institutions all around the world, they're all coming in. Sorry, guys. But I gotta do what I gotta do. I gotta do what I gotta do, including invoking the Insurrection Act of 1807. Thank you for tuning into the rabbit hole. I know it's scary. I know it's scary. What are you going to do? Call me a fearmonger for reporting on the fucking truth, on history, on the whitehouse.gov? Sorry. If you're watching this live, you stay. The live stream's going to continue. If you're watching this pre-recorded on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Costs you nothing. Helps me immensely. If you do want to help the channel financially, because this is real independent media and I have no funding and I never had a conversation with an advertiser or a billionaire, all you got to do is become a patron on Patreon for $5 or become a member here on YouTube for $5 or buy some of the dope-ass merch down below or use the 40% off discount for the Advantage subscription on Ground News. Okay? I love you. Be safe tomorrow. Don't do anything I would do. But yeah, no, dead ass though. Be safe. Never stop fighting. Always be careful. I'll catch you in the next episode.